Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Mr. Sasseo's YouTube videos. Today we're going to be going over abiotic and biotic factors and keystone species, so make sure that you follow along in your notes. And if you have any questions, you can ask them the next time we meet. So, how do organisms depend on each other for survival? So, one of our themes of biology was that organisms depend on one another. So, the first thing that you have to realize is that every ecosystem consists of two key factors. The first factor we call biotics or biotic factors. You'll see it both ways. So that's why I put it in parentheses. But biotics or biotic factors only include living things in an environment. So you can picture if you are in a desert or something. There are plenty of biotic factors that you would find there. Like in this picture alone, you can see a bunch of different species of plant that are alive. So you've got like cactus, you've got small shrubs. It looks like there might be like little flowering plants too. But there are plenty of biotic factors we can't see. Like, there are scorpion probably. There are going to be birds all over the place, things like that. What is the opposite of a biotic factor? You have an abiotic factor, or abiotics. Now, a lot of times people get the word abiotic and antibiotic mixed up. Antibiotics, those are like medications and stuff, okay? They are very different. So abiotics include non-living things in the environment, because remember, ecosystems consist of the community that lives in that area, and then also all of the other things like climate and soil and water. All of those are abiotic, okay? And so that includes, things like rocks, air. If there's a water source like a river, that would be an abiotic factor. Okay, so what happens when you change abiotic or an abiotic factor? Now, if you change one of those things, it can affect the ecosystem in like crazy ways. So we tend to call those the ripple effect. And the ripple effect is just exactly what it sounds like. You change one thing, and then that change influences many, many, many other things. So the first definition that we need to kind of talk about is the word biodiversity. So biodiversity, that would be the assortment or variety of living things that you find inside of an ecosystem. And so here's like, a great picture of the biodiversity that we just find everywhere on Earth. The more biodiversity an area has, the greater the likelihood that some of the species will survive if there is a huge change. Like, so if that ripple effect starts because we've changed something, the more biodiversity, the better. And that's because the more living things there are in an environment, the greater the diversity of those organisms in the environment, the more likelihood that, there will be something else that will be able to take the place maybe of the thing that you changed, okay? So you can just imagine different abiotic factors have crazy influence on the amount of biodiversity. So what would be some of those? Just think in your head. All right, so tropical rainforests have the most biodiversity on land. That's without question. Biodiversity tends to increase as we go from the poles, like the North and South Pole, towards the equator. So the equator is where you find most biodiverse area that you can live. So that would be, again, tropical rainforests are found along the equator for that reason. But if we're looking at the most biodiversity of any place on Earth, that would definitely be the ocean. So the ocean definitely has more biodiversity than any other place that we'd ever find, even on land. All right, so what is a keystone species? So we just talked about the ripple effect. So a keystone species is any species that has an unusually large effect on an ecosystem. So that means if you were to remove it, the ripple effect would be great and would be felt all over the place. So here are a couple of examples. We're not going to get through all of them, but I want to at least go through 3 or 4. So, if we're looking at like a pine forest, like a coniferous forest, you can imagine that if you were to remove the pine trees from the pine forest, that would totally affect the biodiversity. But we're going to focus on animals this time. So first example, beavers. So beavers turn rivers into lakes by building dams. They actually flood forests. And so what happens when you flood a forest is that more fish species can live, because stagnant water means that fish are going to stay there longer than if they were in a river. If they're in a river, they're going to get carried downstream. But if they're in a lake, that means they're going to stay there. They're going to actually reproduce more. And so the amount of fish species increases dramatically. And there we go. There's our cute little beaver. Now, also, weird little fact is that birds lay their eggs around dams so that they can be kept warm. Beavers create a lot of heat, and so when they stay in their dams, birds can lay their eggs on the surface of the dam, and the beavers just breathing and living produce enough heat for those birds to be able to leave their nests and to be able to go around and to be able to spread to other areas too. And so you can see kind of a little brief diagram there in the corner of how that works. Another interesting one, sea otters. So this is true. Sea otters are my favorite animal, but especially in California's ecosystem. So sea otters are one of the only animals in the ocean that eat sea urchins. Sea urchins have almost no natural predators. In case you don't know, that's a sea urchin, that little purple thing that it's eating right there. So sea urchins eat kelp. Specifically, they only eat the roots of the kelp. So where fish lay their eggs tend to be in these gigantic seaweed kelp gardens. And so fish lay their eggs all over seaweed. Now, the only problem is that when sea urchins start gnawing on these little roots that are, anchoring them to the ground, that means that the kelp actually floats adrift to sea or washes ashore, which is why sometimes you just are at the beach and you find kelp just randomly on the beach. So without sea otters, sea urchins would pretty much eat all of the kelp, and fish populations would start to go down because they aren't able to have a safe place to lay their eggs. Ladybugs. So you're familiar with ladybugs. Ladybugs eat aphids, and aphids are these tiny little green bugs, and they are a nuisance in most gardens. They eat only green leaves and stems of plants, and they kill plants because then the plant can't undergo photosynthesis anymore. So you can actually buy containers of ladybugs so that you can put them in your garden and they'll eat all of the aphids in your garden and then fly to other gardens and do the same thing. So without ladybugs, plant biodiversity would go down because aphids would start eating all of your gardened plants. Last but not least, sea stars. So sea stars are one of the only animals that eat mussels. And so mussels reproduce extremely quickly and can start pushing animals out of their beachshore homes. Those are what mussels look like. Without sea stars, biodiversity around the beach would be very, very slim. You can see a sea star eating a mussel. They're actually able to liquefy the inside of the mussel, and then they kind of slurp it out with like their like a straw almost, because they have two stomachs. And those are examples of keystone species. So if you have any questions, make sure that you ask, and you've hopefully been following along and writing down your notes.